All right. Yes. Yes. Okay. Ricado Jacobs from the Cape area has been doing for many years a lot of work on land and agrarian reform and food issues. And of course, land is a key issue in colonialism, settler colonialism. And when he went to do his PhD work at Johns Hopkins, and the first major article he published, that first article immediately got two major awards. The Eric Wolf Prize from the Journal of Peasant Studies, and another award from the political economy of the world system sections of ASA. So that's quite a distinction. And obviously, Ricado is a valuable asset as an educator in many settings that I can think of. And UCSB Global Studies, where he is now a professor, is very lucky to have him on board. So Ricado, thanks for joining us. Welcome to you, a warm welcome.
All right. Thank you, Jan, for those warm West Coast welcoming. Yeah, let me just share my screen. And all right, can everyone see that? Is it clear? Can you? Yeah. All right. Let me start. Yeah. So the thank you for that welcoming and the opportunity to share some of my initial thoughts. It's a paper that me and another colleague are working on. But this also precedes thinking about this question, which has in critical agrarian studies are understood as the agrarian question. And basically what I'm trying to do is to rethink this question in relation to the monumental global struggles that are unfolding globally in the 21st century. The gift of the Indian farmer protest, I would argue today, is striking at the heart of what we can think of as the agrarian question in the 21st century. Because it's putting the oppressive and exploitative class, caste, and gender agrarian relations and the corporate control of the food system on the table, which I think is the most fundamental question that we have to think about. The second question that the Indian farmers' protest in particular is also putting on the agenda is to think about how do we reorganize agriculture and food production on an entirely new social ecological basis. And so I'm looking at these different struggles, not as cases, but as illustrations of a broader point for us to think about. Can we continue to think about this question within the capitalist relations, and what does it require for us to think beyond that? And I think these different monumental struggles, whether in India, in Indonesia, between labor and environmental protests, the US, all over the place, is allowing us to reconceptualize what is thought about as capitalist modernity and superseding capitalism. And I think it's important for me and a lot of people to think about the self-activity and independent self-organization of movements that are sort of building blocks for thinking about an anti-capitalist agrarian change. So these sorts of struggles, in my view, is putting new sorts of questions on the research and political agenda that I think we should start to grapple with in a more systematic way. Of course, I'm standing and building on a new body of scholarship that are emerging that are rethinking these questions, and I'm just building on them and seeing what if I can make a small contribution in that regard. So the agrarian question, of course, the most The contribution have mostly come from the Marxian tradition, its origin. And I want to first to think about this notion of within Marxism, and also Marx himself provide us with a way of thinking that transcends the Eurocentric and Western Marxian approach to it. And although, all right, here we go. So, what I want to do is basically I think I've skipped. Let me go back. So this is the famous letter that Marx wrote to Vera Zasuluj about her question about England and the transition debate. And here the most important point for me is when in his response to Vera Zasuluj, Marx says that the commune is the fulcrum for social regeneration in Russia, meaning that the commune could potentially be a basis for an anti-capitalist transition. And the second point is in the second edition of the Communist Manifesto, this question Marx already puts forward. And basically to the question, can the Russian Общina, a form, take us directly into a communist form of communal ownership? Of course, in Marx writing, he sort of suggests that, yes, it can be a starting point for us to think about communist development. Now, a lot has been written about this. For me, the important thing is to think about what does this mean for us in the 21st century? And what type of questions does it elicit for me? Like for me, it raises two questions. One, is the agrarian question resolved within a simple transition to capitalism? Or if you have generalized commodity relations on a global scale? And the second question is, do current social struggles and existing communal organization of land present us with a point of departure beyond capitalism, as Marx have suggested, both in the Manifesto of the Communist Party and in his famous letter to Vera Zasuluj. And here I'm trying to suggest that we beginning to break away from a mechanical and stageist conceptualization of the agrarian question and the debates that have up to now sort of captured the imagination of scholars on this question. So basically, briefly, what is the classical agrarian question that has been sort of put to us as a dominant way of thinking about it? Here, I want to argue this is the dominant way in which the agrarian question is framed. And I would suggest this is also the biggest problem because it presents, at the level of abstraction, it presents us something of reality which doesn't fit reality and a very mechanical way of thinking of it. Nevertheless, the first point is that it sees the agrarian question as the role of agrarian classes in the struggle for democratic socialism. Two, what does it do for the transition to capitalist agriculture and changing the social relations of production and the productive forces? And three, the role of surpluses in the accumulation necessary for industrialization. Now, the geographer and sociologist Jason Moore added another component to it, which he added the ecological question in relation to using in the Marxian framework, the metabolic rift and metabolic shift framework. Now, this framework has been critiqued by many. I am not the first, but it is still within the framework of this mechanical and stages framework because it suggests to us that, well, agrarian AQ2 and AQ3 has been resolved, right? And what is remaining is this AQ1 and AQ4, that capital relations in the countryside and capitalist agriculture has basically resolved these two questions. So it's still locked into this Eurocentric scope and thought and a mechanical way of thinking about this question through. Now, this leads us to what I have, drawing on Giovanni Arrighi in another context, in his paper of 1998 on capitalism in a modern world system, where he says, rethinking the non-debates. So I'm calling this linear transition non-debates is still continuing, and its afterlife is still continuing. And although it's a non-debate, albeit an important non-debate. If you can think about the Dobbs, Sweezy, Wallerstein, Brenner, and today we are said this debate is between Terence Byers and Henry Bernstein. But at the center of this linear thinking is the argument that the transitions are complete, and the use of the concept of transition as what I think is an overdetermined category, and the assumption that commodity relations have spread everywhere because of neoliberal globalization, and therefore solving the agrarian question in a sense of capital, as they put it. And then what I argue is that this form of treating the agrarian transition as a structural issue of political economy, stripped of all agency. Now, here is the important point that I want to emphasize, that because these protagonists argue that commodity relations has been achieved, therefore they conclude, and one has to think about what is the political consequences if the agrarian question has been resolved. Now, for example, in South Africa context, and I quote, Henry Bernstein argues in a paper, he says, the land and agrarian question may only be a modest part of that project, despite their weight in the historical making of capitalism in South Africa and the region. So basically, the linear transition debate treats primitive accumulation and ongoing dispossession as a natural process, that we should accept the progress of capitalism, right? Now, I sort of want to characterize this way of thinking and drawing on the work of Gillian Hart as a way for us to, two things that are happening: the naturalization of primitive accumulation and ongoing dispossession, and the dialectic of the denaturalization of primitive accumulation and ongoing dispossession. Here, what I'm arguing is that with this notion of agrarian modernization, when you establish capitalist relation and producing on a global scale, that you bring sort of agrarian modernization and sort of naturalizing dispossession. And this is, I think, at the heart of the debate in India at the moment, where this notion of bringing some form of agricultural modernization through the corporatization of production relation. And the second point is that through this process, you are sort of legitimizing ongoing racialized dispossession and sort of naturalizing primitive accumulation, even historically, which could never be, if it was a natural process, you would have not required the violence and the coercive elements to compel people to go into factory work to produce when you separate people from the means of production. Now, on the opposite scale, I'm arguing that the struggles and the insurgent agency is mobilizing against this historical and ongoing dispossession. And our theoretical approaches needs to catch up to this and incorporate it into our way of thinking. Again, because I'm arguing the political consequences of this is to accept that in the US, in South Africa and others, that modernity has arrived and we cannot reverse it. It's national progression that we have to think about it. Now, of course, this reality does not fit into many spaces of the global South. For example, in Southern Africa, accumulation happened mostly on partial dispossession, and it was spatially divergent, I would argue. And this is an important part for me, and I think for others too, to think about what does this mean? When groups are engaging in struggle and basically denaturalizing notions of primitive accumulation and ongoing dispossession, because ongoing dispossession is a feature of capitalism, right? But we shouldn't treat it as a natural progression in the modernization feature. So what I am proposing, and I just want to briefly state that instead of thinking it as a once-off transition from one form to the other, is to think of transition as a permanent and ongoing process, right? With temporal and spatial unevenness, and those that are considered conventionally as archaic or primitive social formations have always been an integral part of capitalist modernity, right? And it shouldn't surprise us when these struggles emerge out of nowhere, because it's integral part of capitalist modernity. And then these transitions, instead of a natural process, is eventually essentially an outcome of class and political struggles. So this brings me to the point of how I want to think about the different struggles and what it sort of means for us, and opening up new fields of possibility within and beyond capitalism. And I think if we just follow the self-activity and independent self-organization of subaltern groups, I'm arguing it is sort of creating new historical possibilities, right? And its outcome, is both uneven and is not predetermined, right? Without sort of romanticizing and essentializing subaltern struggle, because there's a lot of contradictions within. But I'm saying within that, one has to think about what does it present to us? What is it screaming at us that it's showing us different ways of approaching it, both in theory and in practice, right? And one of the things that I think it does show us is the anticipatory character of these class and political struggles within capitalism, right? And its anti-capitalist tendencies. However, one has to pay attention to the specificity and the particularity of this capitalist development in different spaces. And I would argue, building on Archie Mafeja, that we require a theory of mediation between what he suggests is the historical general totality and the historical specific totality. So this pushes us in a way of thinking of a new comparative political and research agenda whose goal is the construction of a historical specific totality that incorporates in our analysis an understanding of both the general processes and its historical specificity, and that we pay attention to agency from below and take seriously self-activity and the independent self-organization of subaltern classes. Now, I want to argue that all of these struggles that we think of them, I think of them not as cases, as I've said before, but as illustrations that holds important lessons and implications for both the field of critical agrarian studies, but I always also say global studies and how we think about new struggles that are emerging in periods of crisis or even in non-crisis. So these are just illustrations that I'm trying to put forward, and I have not done necessarily field work in this, and I know I'm not treating it as cases. The one that stood out for me was the 2016, 2017, perhaps ongoing struggles of the indigenous people and its Standing Rock against the North Dakota Access Pipeline. Here I'm arguing that what the struggle is doing is putting, one, the question of land on the table, two, property relations, three, and environmental struggles, right? And the question is, how do you solve the land question within settler colonial societies, even in countries as advanced, developed as the US? And what the Standing Rock struggles or the movement is showing us is that these questions do not get resolved even if you have fully capitalist relations within society. And that here is an example of the temporal forms that continue to coexist and continue to struggle for ways in which I mean, indigenous sovereignty in this case. And here I want to take a quote from Chief Auro Lookinghorse, and I got this from this interesting book, an important book, I think, from Masumela Tomba. But here, I think is an important building blocks for what is being said here, is that one, we have no choice but to follow, right? Two, and that understand that Mother Earth is the source of life and not a resource to be exploited, and not heeding warnings from both nature and people will keep us on the path of self-destruction, right? But if we examine the struggle itself, it is putting up a lot of issues of common possession and access to land, and the conception of private property is put into question, right? So the question is, within the struggle of indigenous people, which is the struggle for land, but not the struggle for private property, right? And it's putting a different type of social property relations on the table that I think is important. And here again, we have the case of where the past is constantly intruding on the lived experience and the present, right? So this is the first illustration that I want to use of the Standing Rock example. Of course, there are many, many facets into it, and I'm just using it to illustrate the point about the importance of the agrarian question, even in a country like the US, which the assumption is, I mean, in the earlier framework that this question has been resolved, we have capitalist agriculture and there's no need to bother with ourselves. They're producing high input food. And this is the question that for me, at least that Standing Rock is putting on the table. The second point, the second illustration that I want to highlight is in Southern Africa, and in South Africa in particular. Here you have a small mining village, a rural village, not a mining village, in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, who has been engaged since 2008 in a protracted struggle against an Australian mining company that wants to mine sand dunes for titanium. It's called in Pondoland Kolobeni, in the Wild Coast, a very pristine area. And this mining company and this small community has been engaged in a protracted struggle, right? At some point, this was, they call the struggle the Standing Rock of South, you know, this is South Africa's Standing Rock struggle. And there's a lot of parallels besides the comparison, because first, this was part of the old communal areas in Bantustans. Of course, we don't have Bantustans anymore. This is a very small community. Their primary ways of organizing is there's still a chieftaincy. It's still a communal way of organizing. And I use communal in a sense, in inverted commas, and we can still talk about that. But the key point is that they formed this Amadiba Crisis Committee to defend the right to land, and they see themselves as the stewards of land, right? And the community struggle is precisely against the fact that the mining will not just destroy their livelihoods, but also the land and the planet. And this has been their organizing principle of resisting this mining company. Now, what is interesting is that one can see, and this is one of the community activists who says that we know who we are because of the land, right? And we also believe that it's our right to live in a healthy environment. And the most important part is that women must be part of the decision-making, right? There should be no discrimination in terms of gender. And if we do that, we're going to build a healthy nation. So in a similar vein, again, the issue of the ecological question is raised, property relations, and land that is just beyond just the productive assets, that there's other meanings that is attached to it as well, that I want to highlight in this case. But what has been the key demand is to continue with land and agricultural based livelihoods. And basically having environmental demands, but key for them was participatory decision-making and the right to say no to mining, which I think is a significant part of the struggle. And they have been engaging in this struggle. In 2018, the courts ruled in their favor in saying the communities in these type of societies and this type of tenure system have the right to say no. What it shares with both the Standing Rock and this example is that the level of violence by the state and capital. Here, some of the leadership was killed and assassinated. And if we think about the Standing Rock protest, the violence the colonial violence that was unleashed there is the same type of violence that has been unleashed in these mining communities. In fact, it is suggested that 90% of mining rights application is now in these communal areas. It's going to be in South Africa, at least in these communal areas, which is going to create new forms of struggles. And this is just one of these type of struggles that is unfolding within these communities. Now, what is interesting about this particular example or illustration is that in a fact that is less talked about in the South African historiography is that these people and these communities, and I use communities in the sense, in inverted commas, have a long history of resistance to dispossession in South Africa. In fact, this community was part of a very important peasant revolt in the 1950s and the 1960s that precedes this what everyone knows as the Sharpeville Massacre, but this was preceded by that. Precisely in the 1950s, the state wanted to, ironically, do environmental reasons, wanted to limit their stock numbers. But it was just another way of dispossessing them and forcing them into wage labor. Now, this is important because even today, the current struggles is drawing an important linkages between this historical struggle and what they are experiencing today. More important about this community, and I was hoping to do some field work in the future on this area, is that also this community is also tied to the 2012 mine worker massacre. A lot of the people who were killed come from the same area. So there's an interesting way in which you think about mining that also shapes their understanding about this destructive nature of extractivism, but from workers who were in the mining areas where they got killed in 2012 and moving between these areas. So this is the important point for me about this, and then the role of memory in their particular struggle that I think is important. Now, and of course, my own research, which I've done at another time, the same logic is there again in urban land repossessions. And I don't want to spend too much time, I've on another occasion. But what is interesting in settler colonial societies and even beyond is this notion that people don't have, reject this notion of private property, and even the notion that the state should be the custodian. Because here, one of the interviews that I had says, we are the title deed holders of the land, right? The state are only its custodians. But the title deed holder, this person means is not that they have ownership, right? It's not about ownership, right? The second thing is that they stole this land from our people and the land doesn't belong to them. So there's no, at different historical periods, people would not accept primitive accumulation or ongoing dispossession as a natural process and want to reverse at least its land relations and how land is redistributed. Now, I've talked a lot about that before, and I just want to highlight this particular thing. But one of the things that it again highlights for me is the socialization of land on a use rights basis, because even here there's no ownership of even when they occupy the land outside of the legal framework, people don't allocate ownership rights to each other, but only access to use. right? And they are making an important paradigmatic shift, moving us towards the socialization of land from below, where use rights are transferred to democratic elected self-governing bodies. And I think that for me is the most important point in the way in which they democratically elected bodies allocate certain use rights amongst workers, farmers, and different use groups. Now I want to move on and use the case of Zimbabwe, which I think was one of the most important land repossession movement in the 21st century, but is not getting the same recognition or studied in the same manner as all other movements, you know, in relation like the Zapatista or the MST and all of these movements. And part of my reason is just to put this also on the agenda, that here you had the settler. What is important about the Zimbabwean, and I want to make 3 points, is that you had 2 land reforms. One was the settler colonial dispossession by the former British soldiers who just dispossessed land, war veterans. And you had post-colonial land independence, land repossession, right? Now, what happened in the Zimbabwean case is interesting, because prior to at independence, 15 million hectares of land were controlled by 6,000 white farmers, right? And with land reform, 13 million hectares was transferred to about 2.4 million Black families, which is significant. And with that process of redistributing land, it changed power relations automatically in the countryside and in the country itself. And in the process, denaturalizing dispossession and conquest, even when you had capitalist relations within those societies. Now, this is important for us to understand, because I think this is the most important struggle in the 21st century that has a lot of implications for how we can think about the agrarian question. Of course, it raises a number of points, because now the state is systematically trying to reverse the type of land reforms, and because of pressure from international institutions, the US, the EU, and governments are forcing that there must be compensation given to these former white settler colonial owners of the land. So the important point for me here is that one, even if there is dispossession centuries, or Zimbabwe is a bit different because the dispossession happened in the 1950s, 1960s. But even in a case like South Africa and the US and Canada, New Zealand, all of these places that have centuries of where dispossession happened centuries ago, it still does not make it a natural process, and that you can still have massive land redistribution that should, and I will argue, should happen in these particular contexts. But in the case of Zimbabwe, what is more significant is that the massive land redistribution transformed racialized and class relations in the countryside at a one blow, right? And this puts the question for us, even if you have puts another question that I think on the table is, even can you then have land reform under capitalism, right? Right? And how far can you extend it? Now, all of these struggles, I would argue, raises the most important question in the 21st century, the centrality of the ecological question. And here I am drawing heavily on the Marxian scholars, or the sociologists, environmental sociologists, let me not say Marxian scholars, but environmental sociologists that uses the Marxian framework of the metabolic rift. The most important point that this struggles is highlighting is how the cost of the crisis is shifted onto subordinate social classes and racialized groups in the world. That a pipeline can be conceptualized to go through oppressed groups' territory. That mining can be conceptualized in South Africa, in marginalized and oppressed groups territory, right, is shifting this ecological crisis onto these marginalized groups. And I think it raises the question, when we have an ecological solution in one end, at what cost would it be at another end? So I know one of our colleagues does the question of lithium, you know, and electric cars, but the cost that it will have in terms of environmental destruction still in other spaces. The second component that I think that these struggles are highlighting for us is the restoration of social metabolism as a central component of contemporary social struggles. And how do you restore environmental degradation, right? And I would want to end by saying that what it is saying to us that a lot of these questions cannot be resolved within the framework of capitalism. I want to suggest, and it requires us to think about, I'm talking here about in critical agrarian studies, that we think of another framework and a new way of thinking about the agrarian question as essentially a political and ecological question of anti-capitalist social change. This is what I want to conclude with, that we think about it in those terms. And I want to suggest, this is not a frame, I was not sure whether to call it an approach, a framework, but for examining the agrarian question in the 21st century. And I would argue that, of course, we have to look at the nature and form of transitions within and beyond capitalism. One, two, we have to think about what is the classes and social forces emerging out of these ongoing transitions and the exploitation and oppression of both rural and urban classes. Because as I've suggested earlier, that in my own research, that whether people move to the cities, the agrarian class structure does not get dismantled with urbanization. The fourth one is for us to think about the material and ecological basis for non-capitalist alternative futures. How then will we think about the democratization of social relations? And in the case of the final one, what type of state, as we have seen in the case of Zimbabwe, and what forms of social organization is required. Now, this will take us away from a mechanistic and a stageist way of thinking about the agrarian question, that once you have capitalist relations, you don't have to think about then this question is resolved. Once there's no more peasantry, that the question is about the peasantry, and then that is all that is resolved. So I'm suggesting that we think about it. I mean, I'm calling it a framework, I put it in inverted question, but the way for us examining this question, both within and beyond capitalism in the 21st century. Now, the most important point for me is not the extent to which the peasantry exists, which is one of the questions of these. The question is, who are the agents of social change today in the 21st century, right? And this is what we have to tease out. And it becomes clear that the forces at the forefront of the ecological struggle is indigenous people all over the world, in the US, in the global South, even in countries, even in India, I would say that question of the caste, agricultural relations, gender, in the Indian farmer strike, even in countries like South Africa. And we have to think about how that is going to be transformed beyond capitalism, right? So let me end here by saying this is the type of framework that I'm trying to think through. And yeah, I hope we can have a fruitful discussion on this question. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to you, Ricado. That's a marvelous talk. I see a question by Vladimir. Please, Vladimir. And then Yaching, please. Klaar? Okay.
I was merely clapping. I was merely applauding Ricardo's speech. I'll leave my question until the end. Thank you, Jan.
All right, all right, all right. Please, Claire and Charmaine, I think.
Hi, this is Kaylar, and I was doing the same, so.
Oh, you're also, fine, fine.
I can ask
then.
a question. I can ask a question.
I also have a question, Jan. You go ahead, Satyajit.
Ricado, thanks a lot for that wonderful, kind of restatement that the agrarian question is here to stay for a long period of time. There are two illustrations, I think, which would also have been very helpful in terms of the agrarian question. One is the issue of forestry and privatization of land by commercial interests. The second is also in terms of the intellectual property rights and the issue of seeds, because these are two other issues which have been resonating a lot in South Asia. On the agrarian question, I think there are two important players which have kind of also emerged, which is it's not just an issue of the peasantry anymore. It is also an issue in terms of state resources, whether it is in terms of education. For example, in India, the Dalit communities are not organizing around the issue of land anymore. They're organizing themselves on the issue of education and in terms of access to government jobs. Through which then they would be able to get state resources directed to them, so the indigenous communities, the scheduled tribes, the scheduled castes, they're also moving away just from seeing their fight only as a fight of agrarian issues, vis-a-vis also access of state resources. So I think that is an important consideration in the larger frame of how you situate agrarian studies in modern times. That would be something to look at. The other is in terms of the whole process when you talked about communities, community organizations, community ideas, values, is in terms of community institutions and how many, all over the world, there are these processes of decentralization which is taking place. And for example, in India, Kerala has gone through a process of democratic decentralization, and then the agrarian issues being addressed through this framework. So while the issue of capitalism is still stark, there is also the issue of the state and the state's alliances with capital, and also the spaces which the state is creating to give a voice. So how do you look at the processes of state resources, and how do you look at these new avenues of democratic spaces which has been carved out in the process of decentralization in this wider narrative of the agrarian question? Thank you so much.
Ricado, do you want to respond to this one or combine with the next question of Yacheng? Up to you.
I can respond to this one, and I can take them
respond to this one. Fine.
Yeah. Thank you, Satyajit, for that important question. And that's precisely my framework, or my attempted framework, or aspirational framework, is to say that one of the aspects that we have to examine is the democratization of social relations. Right? So it's not just about the class composition, but also about how do we think about what is important for the democratization of social relations and what type of state. Because as we are seeing in the case of Zimbabwe, that it can easily be reversed too. And so we have to think about what forms of organization it requires from below, but also the form of state. And I think it raises the question of agrarian citizenship. That is an important part of the story that we have to think about beyond whether the peasantry you know, even the historian Hobsbawm made the important thing of the 20th century is the death of the peasantry. But that, for me, the question doesn't fall or live on whether the peasantry exists or not, right? There are other class forces, although I think it's a mistaken view that in the global south, the peasantry is still alive and kicking. But I agree with you, it brings out all those sorts of forces in the forestry. It raises an important question of how do we think about these relations in the countryside? And particularly the question of caste and class relations in which I don't know much about the farm workers, the strike in India, but it raises for me so starkly that the farm workers, which is majority Dalit in places like Punjab and others, but their voices are not elevated. And from reports that I have seen, they're part of the protests, right? The same with women and other groupings. It's also how we think about this question. So yeah, this is, I think the process of the state formation and the type of state we think of is an important question that we have to examine, and particularly in terms of the reversal. I hope that was as clear as mud. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricado. Yacheng, please.
Ricado, thanks for the fantastic and very useful talk. I really love how you covered so much of the different strands of the literature and highlighted the stakes coming from your own work and then your own deeper work, but then also your expanding work and cases around the world. I'm really interested in you talking about what I hear as this move from, you know, you still call it the agrarian question or a re-articulated framework for the agrarian question here at the end, but I sense that there's, you know, this deeper, or not deeper, but there's a transformation, right, in the ecological and environmental consequences that are faced by different communities within national context, but certainly the farm worker protests, Standing Rock, these struggles point to transnational, and although they do center what these questions about state formations that you're discussing in relationship to Satyajit's question, they certainly point to global processes, right? And where a question of capitalist social relations within the immediate milieu is not enough to think about an articulation of the agrarian question within any context and certainly within a global context. So what I'd like to ask is, in this kind of broader view of the agrarian question as embedded in a set of ecological questions or emblematic of one, right? That it's a sort of series of front lines around the world that have to be faced in the context, in the ecological conjuncture that we're in. And I didn't hear you mention climate change, but your work here, I feel like is an important adjunct to other work that brings up a similar set of questions about ecological struggles that are entailed by resistance to climate injustice, and then also simultaneously to different environmental injustices and capitalist accumulation and extractivist projects. And so one book comes to mind. I'm thinking about Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright's book, Climate Leviathan. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in that they look at some basic questions of what kinds of politics such extensive and complicated ecological transformations may entail. And so in relationship to the work that you were presenting, I was thinking about not just democratic transition or what you talked about in terms of naturalizing or denaturalizing forms of dispossession, because in China, you know, there's massive land dispossession, as of course you're aware, and at the same time, massive depoliticization over the last decade of it. And so there's no clear direction or stage mechanistic kind of set of social formations that can be predicted out of these processes. But so my question is how do we think about what you're putting forward as both agrarian and ecological questions, questions of national state formation within a broader question of dealing with climate change as something that's global and transnational and clearly not resolvable. You know, agrarian viability of livelihoods or even food production is no longer going to be a national question, right? This is something that is really basic and Malthusian in a colonial sense, but also in this horrible population sense as well. And I think that's all implicated in what you've presented. And it's a bit in the background, but I'm wondering if you don't mind bringing that a bit to the fore. I don't know if that was clearer than mud at all either, but
no,
super evocative talk. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. What should I do? Should I go ahead and answer?
Yes, please, Ricado.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, and I think you raised a more important question about if we think about the ecological question, it sort of renders the focus on the nation state. It sort of problematizes it because you cannot think about the ecological question in terms of the nation state or an enclosed territory. We have to think about it on a global scale, and particularly when I think I find this useful notion of the metabolic shift, because it allows us to think about how the ecological crisis is merely, you know, if you're going to have a new Green Deal, for example, it's merely going to shift the burden somewhere else, you know, with carbon markets and all of that. So what I'm saying in the process of global capitalism, particularly with the ecological question and climate change, one cannot think about it in terms of national terms. And this is one of the key directions which these struggles are pointing to us in terms of how one in the level of politics, how do we think about this in terms of transnational movements that can sort of think and build new forms of solidarities, right? Because as you say, it takes us beyond just the agrarian question in which we have thought about it. But I'm using it as an analytical tool to sort of signal what am I specifically talking about and what debate am I basically in, because at some sense it also renders what I'm talking about a global question, basically. Another way of putting it is the agrarian question as a global question and how these struggles are thinking and linking it in different ways. So yeah, I would say that this is precisely what I think one should move towards, particularly the ecological question, but also in terms of, for example, to say in the US, but why can we not change property relations without, you know, entrenching private property? And I think the indigenous question is raising the question of land, territory, but not linked to a form of private ownership. And I think that is the question that is on the table on a global scale, that this is the resources of both human and other humans, as indigenous people are referring it to. And this is the interrelation of this particular question. Now, yeah, so let me leave it at that. And let me say, I'm also trying to think through as a way for us to examine this particular question, particularly if you center the ecological question. But the ecological question is also about territory and how we think about that.
Thanks, Ricado.
That's great. Thank you, Ricado.
Thank you.
Daniel, is yours a question that you want to raise? Please.
Yes. So what I like very much about this research, this trend of research, is that instead of asking how to help people on the countryside, I feel like what you're doing is asking how can the countryside help us in the questions of development. What I'm though wondering about is, and how far is this actually something that comes together, capitalism and the agrarian question? Like, is there a mutual interest in solving the agrarian question, or is it rather that your own stance of what you see would be that the agrarian question necessarily needs to break with capitalism, right? So is there like, I guess from the examples you brought about already, there are communities that would argue for the radical break, but I could also imagine that there could be like constructive coexisting examples that you met along your research. And I was just wondering where your stance at this would be, or what kind of inspirational stories you could bring about from there.
Mm-hmm.
Ricado, would you combine with Charmaine's question, please?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ricado, thank you so much. That was so incredibly generative and exciting, and I'm looking forward to talking to you more about this. I have hopefully two questions, and they're sort of linked. So the first question is that, you know, as you were kind of charting in the earlier part of the talk on the problems with the concept of primitive accumulation, one of the issues in the historical Marxist formulation is that one presupposes this kind of stageist form in which extra economic violence becomes superseded historically by the emergence of the universalizing means of the silent compulsion of exploitation, right? So we get the feudal relationship prior, and then a kind of removal of that and into the kind of silent compulsion of labor exploitation. And one of the things that you're pointing to and that other scholars have pointed to is the need to substitute the capitalist question with the colonial question. And so as I was thinking, you know, when you were comparing Standing Rock and South Africa and Zimbabwe, one of the things that you talked about is that the thing that links these cases is the violence of the state in terms of its kind of response to land-based movements. And so I wanted to ask you if you could just tell us a little bit more about how, in thinking through this kind of rereading of primitive accumulation, how does the agrarian question help us to avoid thinking about state violence as extra economic, but something that's sort of fully incorporated into and part of the kind of ongoing capitalist relations that sort of might arise out of a particular kind of configuration of settler anxiety? So how do we get out of this bind, right, of thinking of the political and economic as distinct forms in kind of the ongoing metabolic rift? And then the second question is that there's this kind of tricky way in which, as you noted, indigenous forms of indigenous relationships to land do not necessarily express themselves as possessive forms of relationship to land. And so there's this thorny question of primitive accumulation when we figure it as a theft of land, right? And so in some of the quotes that you used where, you know, indigenous people said they stole the land from our people, there's a strange way that you say steal and then the land becomes retroactively an object of possession. And so Robert Nichols, of course, and Oner Inse write about this. So I guess my second question is, how do we think about or navigate this question of the fact that, you know, one can claim dispossession even if indigenous people do not necessarily think of their relationship to land as possessive? And so is use rights one way of getting out of that, because it's it's not necessarily repossessing the land, but a democratic demand in terms of using the land. But then there's, I think, another kind of anti-capitalist demand made by indigenous groups, which is land back as a demand. And that seems different from use rights, right? In the sense that it's not about usage of the land, which in some ways kind of legitimate the existing state ownership of land, but actually demand a kind of repossession of it into into indigenous communities. So use rights versus land back, is there a kind of difference substantively in those demands? And how do you think about that relationship? Thanks.
All right, thank you for those two questions. I'll deal with Charmaine's questions first, and then I go to Daniel. I think you are raising an important point, and this is the question that I was attempting to highlight with the question of Zimbabwe, right? So you had dispossession by a settler minority. In the US, it's a settler majority. But I think the elephant in the room is, we can say it is a you know, that the social relation doesn't have a private property element to it. But the question we have to deal with, how do we going to break up these ways of organizing this large plantation of ownership? And but what the Zimbabwe question raises for me, and what I'm sort of proposing, is that we need to think about democratically elected structures, right, that can reallocate use, access on a more sustainable ecological basis, right? Because if we, and this is the question, are we just going to leave industrial agriculture intact? Are we just going to leave extractivism intact without, and how we're going to use the land? So I think it's the first step is to sort of repossess. I think there are two elements to your question. The one is to repossess, and the other one is to change the social relations of property relations on a future basis, where it's not based on private property in the way in which we are used to imagine it. Of course, that can only be achieved through struggle. So I don't think the two are necessarily incompatible in terms of thinking about it, because there's a prior step. No one is going to give you the land to use it and think about it. There's a step that we have to revolt. There's the politics of it, you know, and I think the Standing Rock example is showing they're defending an existing resource, right? And this is what is required. It is not about ownership, it's about how this resource could be used, and the right of people to say we want to use it for that democratically, not imposed by capital and the state. The primitive accumulation, I don't know, I'm a bit, I think there are two things, and here I agree with the extent of works of Mike Levin and others. I think we have to separate between primitive accumulation, the origin of capital as this transition phase, and ongoing dispossession. Now, that story is incomplete without slavery, colonialism, racism. It cannot extricate itself in its ongoing, in its afterlife. It's still continuing. And I think that is where I make a separation between primitive accumulation and ongoing dispossession. And I think the two, the violence and the colonial, is integral to capitalist accumulation. You cannot separate it. And that slavery is, for example, one of the building blocks of capitalist development, which is sometimes ignored, but I think there's a huge body of scholarship on that. This might be a bit provocative and controversial, but this is how I think about it. And because otherwise I think we are going in a circular motion. How can you have ongoing primitive accumulation? Start, stop, start, stop. You know, there has to be, what we are talking about is dispossession. And the second point that I want to make, that capitalist development is not even dependent on dispossession in all spaces, right? It allows people to have land and still have capitalist relations continuing. So I will leave it at that to see, this is how I think I approach it. And I have to, but thank you for the question. I have to think about it much more further about that. My point is exactly that within, to Daniel's question, you know, I think what has been conceived as the agrarian question has sort of become distorted within what I would say academic Marxism. Because at its fundamental basis, it's about the transformation of society. It's not about whether you have capitalist relations, right? And here, drawing on Marx on that earlier point, is that, is it enough to make a transition to post-capitalist or non-capitalist formation? It's not about, and then the second component is which classes are going to drive us this process forward. And this is how I look at it, which brings me to the point, the limits of a land transformation within capitalism. And this is what the Zimbabwe case is highlighting, because now they are running into problems of all sorts, and we have to think about beyond capitalism. that is what I'm putting basically on the table in my own reading and building on what others have argued before me. Right?
Ricado, thanks. This is also an opportunity, by the way, to say hello to some newcomer participants like Casey Walsh. Casey, I think of your work on cotton. Beverly Silver from Johns Hopkins. Jean Beeman from sociology. And Patrick. And then, so Casey, a question for you, please. Then Ezra, and if there's time, I slip in a question too. Please, Casey.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ricado, for such a wonderful talk. Very rich, full of a lot of questions, I think, that were never resolved, that are ongoing questions. And so I have sort of two, I guess, comments or questions. One is, how would we benefit from reconsidering this concept of land to be far more expansive? You talked about social metabolism, you talked about political ecology at the end. And land seems to reduce everything into sort of it reduces all of, let's say, nature, in quotes, to a single sort of form of stuff, materiality. But your examples were about water, and water, even as you put it, in a society with fully capitalist relations like the United States, water is not a thing that people can fully own. It's something that they can have rights to. And so usufruct still operates in so many of our relationships around water, even in fully capitalist societies. So that's one, but what also about things like genetic information in plants and sort of these expanding commodity frontiers that exist in sort of a large category that we might call land. So if we break up land into all these things, then how do we think then about the agrarian question a little differently? That's an open, sort of vague question for you. And the second one would be, you use the concept of transition a lot and poke at it. It's a very difficult one because it does have sort of implications about past and future and unidirectional history and things like this, evolutionary assumptions. But you do a good job with that, sort of like making that into a problem. But what if we shifted the concept to another older concept, which is articulation? And how would a notion of articulation help you or help us all think about this question of capitalism and non-capitalism? There's so many arguments about the way that, for example, the community or the commons actually provides for social reproduction in an encompassing capitalist society. And there's so many ways in which, for example, for peasant studies, in which peasant economies generate labor and generate a sort of an a surplus, what's the word, is sort of an overexploited working force for industrial capitalism through migration and other things. So there are these sort of articulations that are going on in an overall capitalist society that may appear as oppositional or anti or post, but oftentimes actually are sort of working within it. This whole discussion on social capital shows that as well, that community formations can actually contribute to the accumulation through things like micro-lending and other mechanisms. So articulation has a slightly different framing than transition of, I think, some of the same kinds of questions that you're asking. Again, sorry for the vague, muddy question, but it was a very provocative talk, and I had these come up. So thanks again.
Thanks, Kees. Please, please, maybe you want to combine this question from Esther, would you?
It might be difficult to combine this question, Jan.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. So let me, thank you, Cassie, right? So yeah, I'm myself thinking about this question, and I've been thinking about how do we think about the agrarian question. I mean, I'm using a given concept, and I'm saying, well, I think it's being treated in too mechanical and stages fashion. The articulation makes me, I understand it, but I have, coming from South Africa and being under the tyranny of Harold Woolpe's articulation of mode of modes of production. I'm a bit reluctant about that concept, although it's useful. Perhaps I think about the co-presence of different temporal forms, and sort of trying to think that capitalism does not operate without these different temporal forms, but they're always present and they coexist. And capitalism basically takes it and subsumes it under its own logic. And that's why you have at different moments groupings and social formations popping up and struggling. And then you say, oh, but is the peasantry not dead? No, because capitalism, and particularly in extractivism, to use the example that I've used, the mining in South Africa, that was basically a Bantustan governed by chiefs. The chiefs and the way of structuring were a labor recruitment agency for the mines. And capitalism didn't bother on destroying that, because if you think about its logic of modernization, it should have destroyed it. We should have not have reserves for indigenous people by now. But so I like the concept of the co-presence, and then it creates its own tensions, and it cooperates, and there's also conflict, right? And all of these are outcomes of struggle, and at one point in our case, people can be co-opted, and other points they resist. So what I am to talk about that is more, I'm more comfortable with the co-presence of different temporal forms and how they exist and give rise to new possibilities and struggles, right? And that the past is an integral part of our present and is always there, lurking and looming and pushing us in different ways. And what I am trying to suggest is that in thought, we always trail behind of what real existing are doing. And it's not easy to catch up to when you think of a standing rock, like I'm trying to do, putting it in an agrarian framework, but it's beyond that. Right? And the beyond that is like, how do we move beyond the existing social, economic, and cultural framework, which is capitalism as a social formation, or as a, to use a lack of a better word, a mode. And it brings me back to the relation of land that is beyond just a productive asset for people who resist it, right? There are lineage reproduction, there are culture, there are other components embedded to it, water, all of these things. And I mean, I'm squeezing it all within in a singular framework, but my point is basically to open it up and to have a less enclosed approach, a theoretical and research approach to these questions. And so I think you're raising these important questions about land, water, culture, all of it. I think a lot of times within Marxism, culture is like a taboo word, but it is sometimes the factor that pushes people to struggle, to resist, to say, yeah, we have to protect our graves. It's not even about capitalist relations. We need our space for cultural practice, and we're going to defend this with our lives. And so I'm saying, how does all of these, and yet this small rural village in South Africa and the Eastern Cape has been slowing down a mining company since 2009. And they have not been able to mine and extract, and people are still in this battle, considering the violence. And this for me is the fascinating part of my whole story, actually, the struggles and what is it pointing to us, both theoretically and practically. Yeah, but thank you for that. The question itself is very fascinating, and thank you.
Thank you, great talk, thanks.
Thanks. Esther, please.
Ricado, what an amazing virtuoso horizon you have given us. Okay, so I'm interested because I'm thinking through many of the theoretical frameworks that you are, like, like the Marxist promise of revolution. Well, the reason that Marxism continues to haunt us is that, and I'm using some of your words, there is a kind of an irresolvable thing in Marxism that you see? And I'm thinking of this irresolvable tensions through music. And, you know, the promise of bourgeois revolution assumes a perfection that I think that your thinking refuses. There is no perfect thought. There is no perfect process. I'm thinking about how the kind of, when you, the affirmation to the necessity of irresolution and as an avenue to imagine and struggle for the impossible, which is what has informed centuries of peoples who have been faced with the most horrific violences that we can imagine. Like this like irresolvability propels us forward. Would you like to say anything about that? I mean, or you can tell me that I'm, you know, whatever, just.
Shall I slip in a question, or Esther, thanks. Shall I slip in a question to Ricado? I'm looking whether there are other questions. All right, I will slip it. Ricado, 2 points. One, capitalism is a 19th century category that has lived on through most of the 20th century, but then transformed 1989 into a struggle, not capitalism versus socialism, but capitalism versus capitalism. Also in the United States, we have New Deal capitalism and we have neoliberal capitalism. These are both capitalisms and they're radically different. The capitalism in the Trump years and the capitalism that's enunciated maybe today with 1.9 trillion bill. It's a different capitalism. So we cannot turn capitalism into the singular. And secondly, we cannot turn it into an agency as if it is unproblematic. Next point. Where has land reform succeeded? South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. And South Korea, Taiwan, Asian tigers are precisely in half a century of development. Those countries, the main countries that have been successes in development. So where does land reform succeed? Where does it fail? This is the difference between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Land reform in the Philippines, not so good. We should open this up, I think, and think of transitions in the plural and modernities in the plural, because this is now it's a plural world. Thanks, by the way, for a marvelous talk, Ricado.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I have clear-cut answers, but I think precisely the question to Esther is that basically what I'm saying is that unlike thinking of transition from one to the other, we have to think about it as ongoing processes, for lack of a better word. And that our task is at each historical period is to tease out what is the form that is taking place. A second component, which I haven't touched upon, is the massive expansion of what is called surplus populations, right? And where do we fit all of these classes and groups and social formations in it? And I'm saying we have to sit back at each historical period. In the 21st century, this question meant certain things. In the 21st century, we have to see what does it mean? And can we think and imagine something else, but also what people are pointing to us through their existing struggles, what they're trying to defend and understand. And what I would argue in terms of Jan, I don't think necessarily just to conclude with Esther, that the capitalism that I argue is that it cannot extricate itself from its colonial processes. It's unable to extricate itself from its racialized forms and class forms. And I use race as, I know, as a construction, but it's political ways in which it dehumanizes others in its accumulation logic, you know, and the othering. So I'm using it in that sense. I would say the most successful land reforms are China, Cuba, that have generated the, I don't know if I would be controversial, that have generated these surpluses for what we are seeing, this massive growth spurts that we have today. It is now fed that the Korean farmers, peasants are still in the struggle. And it shows to the limits of what you can achieve within capitalism. And that at some point you're creating new problems, right? And so what I'm saying, we have to think about what would it mean beyond that for all of us to think about. And I do think it's not capitalism versus capitalism. It is capitalism versus something that we have to transcend and supersede. And I think this is what all of these struggles are pointing to us. I would argue that the Standing Rock and all of these, because let's assume, for example, and I'm not an expert on India, let's assume the farmers in India get what they want. It's going back to the old same system, but the old system was also problematic, right? You don't resolve, it cannot be resolved within this old neoliberal capitalist framework, and we have to imagine something beyond that. And I don't know, because what is not on the table is the caste relations, the farm worker problem, the same in Zimbabwe, the same in other countries. We have to think about how surplus populations are feeding people in the US, for example, and what do you do with that? People who are not part of a territory, but is integral to its operation and functioning. So this is how I would probably would think about it and want to conclude. And that's why I think we have to think about the state form and the forms of organizations, you know, and self-government that we want to have and thinking through this question. And basically I'm saying it is worthy of a research agenda. No, it shouldn't just be a political thing, but it should be really researched and studied within the 21st century, and to really critically and seriously study it, not just as a political question. In the end, it is a political question. But for us to understand what is the consequences of articulating a problem in a certain way as opposed to another way. Right. So yeah. So thank you. I mean, I've benefited a lot from the questions, and it helps me to think through
Ricado,
more.
You're not done yet. There's a question from Gustavo. Please, Gustavo.
Thank you so much, Jan. Sorry to hold you all on. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
That's
so,
fine.
My question was, you know, Ricado, when you're talking about the environmental dimensions, and in some ways how the way of rethinking the agrarian question also makes it a global question. But what I'm wondering is, when we look at examples as the ones you're doing, where we're drawing on particularities of culture, particularities of settler colonialism, the specific historical geographies in one place or another that help us, you know, rethink this, are we then to conclude that in the 21st century, or as if it, or maybe always, there was never one set of agrarian questions, and that when we decenter this Marxist, structuralist, Eurocentric narrative, that what we're really trying to identify are a plurality of agrarian questions, each of them rooted in their own histories and places and cultures? Or when you say this is also a global question, is there also a way that we can talk about a global agrarian question, about a particular new way or a better way, even if it's not new, of framing how agrarian questions are constantly reposed globally at a global scale, where despite particularities, despite differences in cultures and in historical geographies and patterns of settler colonialism or non-colonial relations or non-settler colonial relations, that still there is an underlying common core or an overarching structure of a global agrarian question that we should be trying to identify. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Gustavo. And I think that is, you have summarized the crux of what I'm trying to say, is that an historical theory should be able to reveal the contradictions of a subset within a global system. And what I'm suggesting is that historical specificity is important, but it shouldn't preclude us from studying general processes. And if you look at all of this, it does lead itself to a global question, but we should take historical specificity serious. And I think through struggles, people at different historical periods are putting the agrarian question on the table and on the agenda, and through the processes of capitalism. And I think you have given me a much better summary about the theory of mediation that I am arguing for between the historical general totality of a problem and this historical specificity of a problem, and the mediation between the two as a productive way for us to proceed, both politically and research-wise. Because I don't think we should lose the historical specificity. Because in Southern Africa, the indigenous question does not emerge as it is in the US. Indigeneity means completely something else in Southern Africa, settler colonial context, where you have, for example, the combination of indigeneity, ethnicity, and race, happening on a simultaneous footing, and it has different meanings. So I'm not suggesting we should lose that, because, but I am saying one should, at a global level, try and think about how these struggles can connect, which people already themselves are doing. This notion that some of the activists in this community say, we are the South African version of Standing Rock, for example, is one of those. So yeah, but thank you. I do want to emphasize that I do think about the interweaving in the heterogeneous mix of temporalities, as Tomba calls it, and also historical specificity and the general totality that we should think of. Yeah, thank you very much.
Ricado, thank you very much, and thanks to you all also. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.